We can hire 3 juniors for what we pay you, Thomas. It's just business. That sentence hit harder than any punch I'd ever taken. No warning, no performance issues, no budget meetings, just that smug line across the table from a man I'd trained 2 years ago. I sat in the tiny glass conference room, staring at the company logo behind him, Glenmore Dynamics, and wondering how 18 years of loyalty could be priced and discarded like last season's inventory. My name's Thomas Grant. I'm 47, or was when this started. I'd spent nearly 2 decades building the company's engineering department from nothing. I'd been the first guy to write a line of production code, the one who pulled all-nighters when the database went critical, who interviewed every engineer they hired for the first 10 years. And now I was too expensive. The new CTO, Trevor Langston, MBA, 35, brimming with buzzwords and fake humility, sat across from me, flanked by Kelly from HR, who avoided eye contact like it might give her a disease. I understand this is a shock, Kelly said, sliding a padded folder across the table. The severance package includes 3 months' pay, outplacement services, and a letter of recommendation from senior leadership. I didn't even open it. I just looked at Trevor. 18 years, I said. And I find out like this? Trevor cleared his throat. This was a strategic restructuring decision. You're an incredible asset, Thomas. Don't get me wrong, but we need to focus on scalability, cost efficiency, modern frameworks. You don't know what half those words mean? I cut in. He blinked. Excuse me. I leaned back in the chair and folded my arms. You think because you can say containerization and microservices, that makes you an expert? You've never debugged production at 2 a.m. with a customer threatening to walk. Trevor's expression tightened, but he didn't respond. I built your infrastructure, I said. I wrote the original backend that still runs half your APIs. You can't replace that with 3 juniors. We're modernizing, he said, like that explained everything. No, I wanted to say, you're replacing people who make you feel small. Instead, I nodded slowly. I wanted in writing that this is not for performance. You'll have it, Kelly said quickly. I stood up. Then we're done. I walked out of that office without a word to anyone. No farewell lunch. No speeches. I packed my things in silence while younger engineers watched me from their desks like they were seeing a ghost. Half of them didn't even know how much of their code depended on mine. Outside, the parking lot was bathed in late afternoon sun. I sat in my truck for a long time, hands on the wheel, not ready to turn the key. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Just hollow. Like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left the shell behind. The next morning, I didn't get out of bed. Elaine, my wife of 22 years, sat beside me, reading the severance documents I dropped on the kitchen table the night before. You should sue them, she said. They can't just throw you away. They didn't fire me for doing something wrong, I said. They just did the math. She looked at me, voice softening. That doesn't make it right. I nodded, but I wasn't listening. I was thinking about the codebase, about the undocumented dependencies, about the overlapping cron jobs that only I understood, about the custom logging framework I'd built in 2011 that no one ever bothered to refactor. And I was thinking about Trevor. 3 days later, I started getting calls. Hey Thomas, this is Nate. So, the build server's throwing some weird exceptions. Something about the deployment scripts not matching the new environment? I ignored it. Then, Thomas, it's Sarah. None of the monthly billing jobs ran. Finance is panicking. Could you call me when you get this? And finally, a voicemail from Trevor himself. Thomas, we're experiencing some unexpected challenges. We'd like to bring you on temporarily for consulting, paid of course, to help the team with a smooth transition. That was when the anger started to bloom. Not the explosive kind. The slow, cold kind. The kind that sharpens your focus and makes everything clearer. They thought I was too expensive. They had no idea what the real cost would be. I opened my laptop. Not to help them, but to begin building something of my own. Something better. Something that would turn their smug cost-cutting into the most expensive mistake Glenmore Dynamics had ever made. And as I typed that first line of code, on my time, on my machine, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. I ignored the first call, then the second. By the third voicemail, this one from Glenmore's head of operations, I started to smile. They were unraveling faster than I expected. But instead of feeling smug, I felt tired. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion, one you'd warned everyone about years ago, only to be shoved off the tracks. 1 week after getting fired, I was still adjusting to waking up without a job to go to. Elaine was supportive, but I could tell she was scared. I hadn't shaved in 4 days. I ate cereal for lunch and took walks just to burn off the anger. Then one night, Elaine placed her hand on mine. "They're calling for help, Thomas," she said gently. "You sure you want to just watch them burn?" "I gave them everything," I said. "They tossed me out like scrap metal." She didn't push. She just stood up and said, "Just make sure you're not burning yourself down too." That stuck with me. So when I got the email from an old client, someone I'd supported for over a decade, I clicked it open. "Hey Thomas, Glenmore's been floundering since you left. Not trying to stir the pot, but something feels off. Trevor's making changes too fast, and some of our service guarantees lapsed last week. Is everything okay over there?" They were already noticing the cracks. That same day, I received a formal letter from Glenmore's legal team. Cease and desist. They accused me of interfering with operations, of retaining proprietary information, of violating my severance agreement. Even though I hadn't said a word publicly, hadn't touched their systems, hadn't even so much as spoken to anyone on the current team outside of polite, professional refusals. It was fear, plain and simple. They knew I hadn't sabotaged anything. What they didn't know was how to run what I'd built. Their panic showed in every poorly worded threat. I forwarded the letter to a lawyer, Dana Calder, someone I'd worked with once during a compliance issue, and she called me the same afternoon. "This is garbage," she said. "They're phishing, trying to intimidate you. Have you talked to the press? Posted anything online?" "Nothing," I said. "I haven't done a thing." "Then let them squirm. They don't have a leg to stand on." But the escalation wasn't done. The next morning, a city detective showed up at my door. Said he was following up on a report from Glenmore Dynamics about a former employee possibly tampering with digital infrastructure. "You're joking," I said. He wasn't. I invited him in, calmly showed him my disconnected company laptop, still in the original return box, untouched. I explained how I had no access, no credentials, no incentive. He took notes and left quietly, but that visit flipped something in Elaine. "They're trying to bury you," she said that night. "Not just fire you, bury your name. Ruin your reputation so no one else hires you." I knew she was right, so I started looking closer. That's when I got a message from Nate, a quiet, reliable systems engineer who'd worked under me for years. He asked to meet at a cafe outside town. "Things are going off the rails, Thomas," he said. "Trevor's pushing a complete migration of our backend to some startup cloud vendor. It's happening fast, like really fast. Feels like something's being rushed for a reason." I leaned forward. "A sale?" Nate nodded. "That's the rumor. Something about packaging the company for acquisition, cutting costs, inflating modernization metrics. And your salary?" That was part of the story he gave. "Said you were holding back innovation." "He said that to the board?" I asked. "He said you were legacy infrastructure, a bottleneck, that replacing you with a scalable team would accelerate product delivery." I felt a hot pressure behind my eyes. "But get this," Nate added, sliding over his phone. "The vendor they're migrating to? Northbeam Arc, check out the advisory board. Trevor's name. Right there. Not hidden. Just bold enough to make it seem normal. If you weren't looking for the conflict of interest. He's cashing out," I said, the words tasting bitter. "And he's setting you up as the villain," Nate added. "If anything fails, it's your fault. If it succeeds, he takes the credit." It all fit. The firing, the NDA threats, the detective. Trevor wasn't just cutting costs. He was removing any witness who could blow up the deal. I wasn't a liability. I was a threat. I walked out of that cafe with a folder of internal memos Nate had discreetly copied. Emails between Trevor and the vendor. Talking points. One in particular stood out. Legacy engineer exiting Q2. Transition already in motion. Migration team aligned. Thomas will not interfere. The plan had always been to silence me. But Trevor had made a mistake. He'd taught me to build resilient systems. What he didn't count on was me applying that same logic to people. As I got home that night, a new thought rooted in my mind. They wanted to erase me, but I wasn't going to let them. Not without a fight. I didn't sleep much after my meeting with Nate, not because I was anxious in the traditional sense, but because for the first time since being fired, I felt a thread worth following. The pieces were aligning, too cleanly and too quickly, and the more I turned them over in my head, the more obvious it became that this wasn't about business. It was about Trevor building a narrative that kept him in the spotlight and pushed me into the shadows, neatly removing any opposition from his path, while handing Glenmore over to North Beam Arc like a prize wrapped in buzzwords and budget cuts. That morning, after a long black coffee and a quiet breakfast with Elaine, I pulled out my old notebooks from the home office. The kind most engineers toss out when projects finish, but I always kept them, not for nostalgia, but because they contain what the databases never could: instincts, observations, side notes during late deployments, and questions that no ticket ever answered. I wanted to remember what Trevor didn't understand, because if I was going to fight back, I had to build a case not with noise or anger, but with precision, the way I built systems that never failed under pressure. Later that day, while I was organizing the notes, I got a text message from a name I hadn't seen in years: Raymond Trent. Ray had been Glenmore's first VP of product, the kind of no-nonsense leader who knew when to let engineers do their work and when to step in with just enough vision to steer without micromanaging. He'd left 3 years ago during the first wave of leadership reshuffling, right before Trevor had climbed the ladder, and the rumor was he'd cashed out and gone semi-retired. The message was short, deliberately so, I guessed. "Heard what happened. You free to talk?" I called immediately. Ray picked up on the second ring, and the moment I heard his voice, I felt something I hadn't felt since I'd left Glenmore: clarity. He didn't waste time. "Thomas, I've been following the chatter," he said. "Trevor's spinning a story, and it stinks. He's got people believing you were dead weight, that the architecture team's been trying to rebuild your legacy code for years." I exhaled sharply, trying to suppress the fury rising in my throat. "He fired me on a Thursday and started migrating the core stack that weekend. No documentation, no risk audit, just threw it all into a black box and called it an upgrade." "I figured," Ray said. "Here's why I'm calling. I'm consulting with a private equity group, Helix 9. They've been sniffing around Glenmore for a possible acquisition, but something about the financials smells off. They pulled me in for tech diligence, and the story Trevor's been feeding them doesn't add up. If there's something you can show that exposes the rot underneath, I'll get you in front of the right people." I was stunned, not just by the offer, but by the alignment. "You're saying they're actively looking into Glenmore? That this deal's not sealed yet?" "They want validation," Ray replied. "Trevor's numbers look glossy, but they're suspicious of how fast he's moving. The right insight, from the right person, could stop the train, or at least slow it enough for someone to notice the tracks are missing." I promised to send over what I had: redacted memos, timestamps, deployment notes, and the vendor advisory board listing. But Ray asked for one more thing. "If you've still got access to the old performance logs, the ones you pulled before leaving, show them how stable the system was before Trevor's push. They need proof that what he's calling outdated was actually bulletproof. Show them it wasn't the system that failed. Show them it was him." That night, Elaine stayed up with me. She didn't ask questions, didn't try to steer me. She just brought coffee when I looked like I was fading and listened when I needed to talk something out. At one point, around midnight, I turned to her and said, "If this goes wrong, it could get ugly. Legal ugly." She just smiled softly, the way she always did when she wanted to remind me I wasn't alone in this. "Then make sure it doesn't go wrong. You're not out for blood. You're out for truth. That still means something." By the end of the week, Ray had reviewed everything I sent him and looped me into a secure call with Helix 9's diligence team. It wasn't a courtroom, but it felt like one. They asked questions like lawyers, measured and exact, and I answered each one with a level of detail that only someone who'd lived in the system could give. I walked them through the infrastructure, explained the cascading dependencies, the smart caching layers, the reason we hadn't moved to microservices years ago, because every cost-benefit analysis showed our monolith outperformed the modular fantasy that consultants kept pushing. I showed them the logs, the uptime, the cost efficiency. I showed them the truth. At the end of the call, one of the partners said, "You know, Thomas, this doesn't sound like a man who was too expensive. This sounds like someone who was protecting the company from burning itself down." I said nothing. I didn't need to. 2 days later, Glenmore's board sent me a letter. Not a threat, not a warning, but a request. Would I be willing to meet with a member of the board privately to discuss what I knew and why I believed the transition plan posed a material risk? I said yes, not because I wanted revenge, but because someone had finally stopped pretending Trevor was a visionary and started asking real questions. The next morning, I put on the same suit I'd worn to my last Glenmore leadership presentation and drove downtown. I felt calm, not victorious, not smug, but steady, like a man who had just reached the edge of the storm and was walking back into the light. What I didn't know yet was that the real twist hadn't even landed. Because when I walked into that meeting room, the board member waiting for me wasn't just anyone. It was Janet Mallory, Glenmore's former COO. She'd disappeared last year after a sudden leave of absence, and now here she was, smiling like she already knew the next part of the story. "I've been waiting for you to speak up," she said, closing the folder in front of her. "Trevor's not just reckless. He's dirty. And you and we're going to bring it all into the light." I didn't expect to feel anything when I saw Janet Mallory again, but as she pushed the folder toward me and sat back in that minimalist glass conference room, so similar to the one where I was fired, it all came rushing back. She'd been the only executive at Glenmore who ever understood what we built under the hood, the only one who didn't see engineers as tools, but as people keeping the wheels from flying off. And now, here she was, holding a file thick with documents that looked like they hadn't seen daylight in months. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I resigned before the Trevor mess got traction," she said, her voice low and measured. "He came in with charm and a fresh strategy and immediately started trying to bury the systems that actually worked. I pushed back. He called me resistant to progress in front of the board. I left before I could be part of the fallout." I opened the folder. Inside were timelines, redlined strategy memos, vendor agreements with Northbeam Arc signed months before the board was officially informed. There were consulting contracts for shell companies, names that didn't exist in Glenmore's financial disclosures. One company billed hundreds of hours to migration strategy and was tied directly to Trevor's college roommate. My jaw tightened as I flipped through. "They were laundering the transition," I said quietly, reading line after line. "Padding expenses, pushing out legacy staff, then spinning it as operational streamlining." Janet nodded. "And guess what else? Trevor's wife owns a private holding firm in Delaware. Guess who owns a slice of Northbeam Arc?" That detail hit like a slap. The chain was complete. Trevor wasn't just engineering a fast exit. He was building a parachute stitched from lies and wrapped in shareholder smiles. He'd turned Glenmore into a trophy to flip, using buzzwords and blind trust to carve out a personal windfall. "I tried to warn them," she said. "But no one listens when your title disappears from the org chart. Until you find someone with nothing left to lose," I replied. She smiled faintly. "Or someone smart enough to make sure he does." That afternoon, Janet and I built a timeline, my data, her internal documents, and a quiet call from Ray confirming that Helix 9 had placed the acquisition under formal review. They weren't pulling out, not yet, but the due diligence team had red-flagged the proposed migration path and had requested direct answers from the board. Glenmore had 48 hours to respond. That gave us 2 days. I spent the next morning working from Janet's home office, combing through a backup drive of deployment snapshots I'd made during my final weeks. Nothing proprietary, just compiled statistics, architecture maps, and logs showing system stability before Trevor's changes. Combined with Janet's emails, most of which had been deleted from Glenmore's servers but recovered from her own devices, we now had a web of connections that painted a very different picture of Glenmore's cost-efficiency push. We prepared a briefing deck, not for revenge, but for defense, for preservation, for truth. There was nothing flashy in it, just clean numbers, verified patterns, and one damning conclusion. Trevor Langston had misrepresented technical risks, lied to the board about vendor relationships, and knowingly sidelined internal expertise to enrich himself through an unvetted migration strategy. That evening, Janet made a call to a board member she trusted, one of the older partners, a man named Hal who had seen Glenmore survive 3 recessions and knew what a TechCon looked like beneath the polish. He agreed to review our packet privately and promised to bring it forward. "You sure about this?" Janet asked as we watched the sun dip behind the skyline. I nodded. "They already painted me as a saboteur. All I'm doing now is showing them who really set the fire." By the next morning, everything moved fast. A closed-door board session was called with Trevor strongly encouraged to attend. Rumors swirled through the engineering community. People who'd never spoken to me before started texting to ask what was happening. One even joked, "Did you finally put a bug in the system?" I didn't reply. I just waited. By noon, I got a call from Dana, my lawyer. "Thomas, did you blow something up?" she asked, half joking, half worried. "I just got a call from a Glenmore rep wanting to retract the cease and desist and requesting a meeting to clarify outstanding misunderstandings." I smiled for the first time in days. "Tell them I'll think about it." At 2:14 p.m., the first leak hit the tech blogs. Glenmore Dynamics pauses migration amid allegations of internal conflict, questions raised about vendor ties. The article didn't mention names, but it didn't need to. Anyone who had followed the company's sudden transformation knew what was happening. The comments exploded: engineers, ex-clients, analysts, all connecting the dots. Within hours, someone posted the advisory board screenshot of Northbeam Arc with Trevor's name circled. And then came the call I never expected. Trevor. His number popped up on my phone like a ghost rising through water. I didn't answer. He called again. I let it ring. Then came a voicemail. "Thomas, listen. I think things have gotten a little out of hand. We both want the same thing. What's best for Glenmore? Let's talk. I'm willing to make things right." No apology. No admission. Just panic, disguised as negotiation. He called again the next morning. This time he left a longer message. "I didn't mean for things to go this way. You and I, we're both builders, Thomas. Maybe we started from different places, but we can still fix this. You want your reputation back, right? Help me stabilize the narrative, and I'll make sure you land on your feet." That's when I realized Trevor still didn't understand me. I didn't care about landing on my feet. I cared about walking away with my head held high. That afternoon, Glenmore's official statement hit the newswire. They were pausing vendor transitions pending further review and exploring governance concerns raised by former executives. Trevor wasn't mentioned by name, but the message was clear. His deal was unraveling. His board's shield had buckled, and the house of cards he built was about to collapse in front of everyone. I didn't gloat. I didn't post anything online. I didn't call old colleagues to say, "Told you so." Instead, I sat on my back porch, next to Elaine, sipping coffee, watching the late summer sun stretch over the lawn. The storm had passed, but I knew there was still one more move to make. One that wouldn't just bring the truth full circle, but force Trevor to finally face it. And that's where I made my decision. I wasn't going to disappear. I was going to step into the light. 2 weeks after Trevor's deal began to publicly unravel, I was asked to speak at a private industry roundtable in Boulder, a modest event for CTOs and senior engineers, mostly folks who still believed systems should be built on trust and not just metrics. Ray had floated my name as a last-minute replacement for someone who dropped out. I wasn't there for applause. I just wanted to set the record straight. The talk was simple. No drama, no names. Just a story about what happens when leadership forgets that what looks efficient on a spreadsheet can be catastrophic in the real world. I talked about loyalty, about silence, and about the danger of removing experience in favor of short-term gain. The room stayed quiet the whole time. Afterward, a woman from a cybersecurity firm approached me with a card and said, "We don't need saviors. We need grown-ups who remember how to hold the line." I didn't take a new job right away. I wasn't in a hurry to bounce back, to rebuild something just to prove I could. For the first time in years, I let myself breathe. I cooked dinner with Elaine. I taught our son, Evan, how to fix the carburetor on an old motorcycle I'd bought off Craigslist. I read books. I went for long walks. My life was quiet, and that quiet felt earned. Then one evening, just as the sun was disappearing behind the trees, I got an email from Glenmore's board. This time, not a warning or a legal threat, but a formal apology. Trevor Langston had stepped down. No press release, no farewell tour. Just gone. Northbeam Arc had also withdrawn from its vendor agreement after investors balked at the optics. I read the message twice, then deleted it. The next morning, I pulled a box down from the top shelf of my home office closet. It was labeled Glenmore Legacy, and inside were printouts of old system maps, handwritten notes on critical failovers, and a copy of the very first architecture review I'd submitted nearly 17 years earlier. I flipped through it slowly, page by page. Elaine walked in while I was still holding the folder. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "I just needed to remember who I was before all of this." She sat beside me, resting her hand on mine. "And I was someone who built things that lasted," I said. "Not someone who begged to stay." Later that week, I returned the call of a recruiter who had been persistent in a respectful way. He was representing a startup spun off from a nonprofit, building emergency response systems for state governments. The tech was messy, underfunded, and vital. They needed someone who could make it real. Someone who didn't chase shiny trends. I said yes. Before I started, I got one last message. This one came from a private number with no name attached. Just a single line. You could have just walked away. I stared at it for a while, then typed back. You shouldn't have underestimated the cost of disrespect. And then I blocked the number. I don't talk about Glenmore much anymore. Not because it doesn't matter, but because some things only make sense when left behind. Every now and then, someone brings it up, usually at conferences or on tech panels, and I just smile and say, let's talk about what we're building now. But I'll tell you this. Every time I look at a team photo or a system schematic, I remember what it felt like to be labeled too expensive. I remember the silence of that glass conference room. I remember what it's like to lose something you gave your life to. And I remember the moment I realized I didn't need to prove anything to people who never valued what they had. Trevor thought I'd go quietly. He thought cost was just a number. But I was never expensive. I was priceless. And now, I build for people who understand the difference.